Hey, Afi, so how am I going to share my screen to the Zoom?
Are we good? Oh, what's your question now?
I'm hungry.
Let me see your.
Why everybody is speaking? You ask me, I'm okay. Okay. Off your mic.
So you can come. Somebody giving me a lesson.
We can't hear you online. No, we can see Brian talking, but we can't hear you. Admin?
Check. Wait and see. So let me tell you a story about Anansi. But first of all, let's, Innocent, could we go to the next slide and do quickly? Check. Oh, this is for online, so we won't hear it here. So we'll run through a presentation, then we're going to have a panel. Interesting panelists who are going to be attacking this topic from a couple of different perspectives, both from academics, as well as from the operational standpoint, from a media and content perspective, as well as from an internet service provider or network operator perspective. Next slide, please. Let me tell you about myself. I am a technology entrepreneur. I think that's probably the easiest definition I was able to come up with. 50% technical, 45% business, and 5% totally mad or crazy or nuts or cuckoo, as we would say in Nairobi. You have to be in this business for as long as I have. I started building internet networks in Africa in the early 90s. I have set up ISPs in Nairobi, in Uganda. I've worked with internet service providers in over 21 African countries, helping them run their networks better. And right now, I crazily embarked on another startup venture, and I am the CEO and co-founder of Converge Technology Networks, which is an internet service provider right here in Malawi. We also have Innocent, who is my co-presenter for this topic, and I will be handing over the presentation to him. And has been with us here in Malawi. Okay, let me know when I can continue, guys. Can I proceed? Thank you. So Innocent is he's been with us here in Malawi for about the last month. He's a PhD student in computer science at the University of Washington. And his research interests are at the intersection of ICT 4D and networks and system design. He will say a little bit more about himself when he comes up here. Next slide, please. So let's start off with a story from Anansi, okay? Anansi loved food. And I think a lot of us here may be able to identify with that. But Anansi's love for food was on another level. It was closer to what many of us may describe as greed. And Anansi loved the food that his wife cooked at home. So one day he was sitting at home waiting for his wife to prepare his dinner. And he had a delicious smell wafting in from the windows. So he went out and followed his nose and came to the house of Monkey. And Monkey was preparing a pot of beans stew, delicious. And Anansi said, wow, this is amazing. And Monkey said, would you like to join me for dinner? And Anansi said, yeah, I would love to join you for dinner. So Monkey said, okay, give me a minute. When it's ready, I'll let you know. So Anansi said, okay, let me leave a piece of my web here and I'll tie the other end to one of my legs. And when the food is ready, just pull the web and my leg will let me know so that I can come and enjoy. And he walked outside and he smelled a delicious smell coming from the other side. And he walked over and he found Rabbit was cooking. And Rabbit had on the stove an aromatic bowl of Kilombero rice from Malawi. You haven't tried Malawi's Kilombero rice, you better try it. This is for the visitors. It's amazing. And Anansi was like, wow, that smells so delicious. I can't imagine how it's going to taste. And Rabbit was like, hey, would you like to join me? And he was like, yeah, I would love to join you. Of course, now it's his stomach doing the talking. He's forgotten his wife is cooking. Monkey is cooking, and now here's rabbit. And he said, okay, when it's ready, I'll let you know. Just wait for me. And he said, okay, do you mind if I tie a piece of my web here? And then I'll tie the other end to my leg. And when your food is ready, please just pull it and I will come back. And he went outside. And the story goes on and on. How many legs does a spider have? He visited lion. He visited antelope. He visited buffalo. He visited 8 different houses, and all of them were cooking, and all of them had these beautiful dishes. And eventually he was tied. And one by one, the webs started being pulled. And initially it was just a little tug. And after it took longer to appear, it became stronger and stronger. And eventually he was being stretched, pulled in 8 different directions, and he was in extreme pain. And he decided, oh my God, I'm going to be torn apart. Let me run quickly and jump into the river so that my web can dissolve and this pressure, I can be released from this pressure. And that's what he ended up doing. Jumped in the river, the webs dissolved, and he came out, collapsed by the side of the river. And when he came to, he found that his legs had been stretched long and thin. And he cried to himself and said, oh no, not only didn't I eat dinner at my house, I didn't even eat any of the dinners that were cooked at any of the 8 houses. And that's why to this day, the spider has long, thin legs. That's a story about Anansi. That's an example of African content. It's a folk tale that's passed on verbally from generation to generation. There's a moral to that story. I won't unpack that. That's not the purpose of this today. But in many ways, our African internet infrastructure, our African internet networks are like Anansi when it comes to content delivery. Everybody else is cooking in their kitchens and designing their own delicious dishes, and we want to be part of that meal. And we're running this one, and we're running to the other. Can we go to the next slide, please? And we are ending up finding ourselves really confused. We would not be complete if we didn't talk a little bit about how Africa's internet has evolved, so that we might be able to understand what's the relevance of African content delivery as a topic for us today. If you look at Africa's evolution of internet, it happened in 3 major phases. Initially, we had end user connectivity, and that's what everybody was focused on. Right in the early days, when I remember we started internet connectivity, I started one of the first ISPs in Kenya in 1996, Homnet Africa. And back then, it was all about dial-up. You had to have a modem, you had to have a phone line, and you had to have an ISP with a bank of modems that you call and then connect people to the internet. That progressed. And today we've had different iterations. You've had wireless, you had ADSL over copper, ISDN over copper. You have the mobile networks, 3G, 4G. I've left out the other Gs, including 5G. I don't even want to start on that one. And fiber optic, which is now becoming pretty commonplace. In many homes, if you have fiber in your house, let me see your hand. I think that pertains to many people, most of the non-Malawians. we are on our way. We are coming. We're almost there. I'm excited because this year we have 2 open access networks launching in Malawi that are connecting over the next 3 years upwards of about 200,000 homes. So fiber optic is probably right now the state of the art as far as domestic connectivity is concerned. You then had international connectivity, and that became the next big headache. As more people were being connected at their home level or office level, the bottlenecks now became the international gateways. And I remember in the early days, as African countries embraced the internet, you initially had countries with a single gateway, satellite-based, managed and controlled by government as a matter of national security. Even the mention or the suggestion that it would be possible to have a separate international gateway for internet services was extremely ridiculous, right? You then had a progression to multiple country gateways as governments began to open up and recognize the value and the importance and the need for redundant connectivity. You had situations, I remember one occasion back in 1998 in Nairobi, when we had the main country gateway, which was somewhere near something called Mount Longonot. It was in the Rift Valley. It was a introductions, of course, there's a lot of South African content. There's a lot of, you know, Egyptian content. There's a lot of Congolese content. Every country has its own movie industry or entertainment industry, and that generates a lot of content. So I've just put out one example of content, and I'll hand over to Innocent. Innocent, it's you next, yeah? And he will talk us through what are some of the technical considerations? What are some of the technology considerations that we need to think about if we as Africa are to consider the evolution or the progression or the development of content delivery networks? And it's good to see we have a couple of regulatory people from regulators here and also from government. I can see a few that I can recognize, and also policy space. During the panel, we're going to have some very interesting discussions around issues that touch on content delivery. So, go ahead. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, everyone. All right, so I will, as Brian said, I will introduce kind of a presentation or proposal that we have for what we hope is a provocative design for a content delivery network focused on African and local content. I'll be quick, but hopefully straight to the point, and that way I can leave room for discussion. So I think there's a lot in this design and what we're proposing that we'd love to get the audience input, and we'd love to get some of our other panelists to get their ideas in on. But as Brian described earlier, this is kind of what a CDN looks like. I recently just started my PhD and constantly learning how convoluted the internet is. You know, you first learn the internet as a set of pipes, and then you start to look into it, and it's a whole bunch of other things and large organizations involved. But basically, the web works like this. If I have content, I choose where I want that content hosted. If I'm in Kenya creating content, the website, I can host that content in Kenya, or I can choose to host it with some nice, shiny hosting service in Ireland or somewhere in Texas. And so I make that decision. I have content and I choose a place to place that content. So the person that owns the content is called the origin server. And then the place I choose to host my content is dependent on the provider I use. And that provider probably has some relationship with the CDN. All right, so I'll be louder. All right, I can project. All right, sounds good. And so that hosting service most likely has a relationship with the CDN, and they use the CDN to globally replicate and distribute their content. And this is important because if you have someone trying to access your really great content that you created in Nairobi, but you're hosting in Ireland and they're in Nairobi, you want that content to get to them as quickly as possible. There are physical limitations to how fast we can send data on the internet. And so bringing that content closer to the user helps speed up and make user experience for that content a lot better. And your CDN is going to go through some ISP at some point. You don't touch directly to the CDN. CDN will connect to your network at some point, and then the client, you as the person consuming the content, are interacting with all of these other players through your ISP. And this is kind of what a CDN tries to do. The CDN makes the work of distributing and syndicating this content a lot easier for everyone involved. You don't have to worry about setting up 50 different servers in case on one night your big hit goes out and then 50,000 people are hitting your servers. So CDNs are structured to help build that out. And so a question here is, and this slides are going very quickly, but does a cooperative operator-owned CDN make sense in general? And does it make sense for Africa? In general, the answer is yes. There are many telcos that are creating their own vertical CDNs internally. So we know that there are people doing that in Western CDNs and exchanges. So the question is, what does it mean for African content creators, African operators, and African networks? And so in order to really solve this, we kind of have to step back at three things that we think needs to be solved if you're trying to build a cooperative CDN. The first is secure and hybrid local content syndication. And what we mean by this is, if I have my content, I want my content distributed in a way where someone's not going to rip it off, right? I want to ensure that my content is secure. I also want to ensure, at least in the context of African networks, that my content's available in a hybrid manner, both online and offline. We have power outages, we have weak wireless links. And so we want this content to be widely available both on and offline. Trust, trust, trust. Anything that says the word cooperative requires people who are in that cooperative to trust each other. And operators don't tend to trust each other because they're after each other's business. And so how do you build a model that works like this to make something like a cooperative CDN work, but also solves this problem of trust? And then the last is high CapEx and OpEx. And so the infrastructure for running a CDN is very expensive. You need servers and replication, you need high bandwidth links, and these things get really difficult to manage at scale. You have to build an organization like Akamai or Google or Netflix in order to manage that capacity at scale. So how can we manage all these different things? And so our proposal at a very, very high level looks something like this. And it's the convening of a couple of different technologies that are available to us today. And those technologies help us tackle those three problems that we had put up there before. And the idea is you as a content creator can encode your content in a format that allows anyone to distribute that content. And the benefit of this format, this hypothetical format, is that no one can rip off, no one can change your content. So you can give it to anyone and they can distribute however they want, whatever means that they want. And they're not limited to just the CDN or the infrastructure that's available. And so these are called secure exchanges. If anyone's familiar with AMP, Google AMP. So Google AMP is a format that, well, AMP is now an open source format that was initially created by Google to accelerate web loading. They realized that web performance in developing countries was really slow and really poor. And so they designed this entire publishing format to make the web quicker. Most likely, if you're reading a news article, if you look at the top of the link, it'll say amp.something. You won't realize, but that content is being syndicated through Google's AMP platform or format. And it's been shown to have really, really great benefits for user experience on the internet. And so secure exchanges are just a generalization of the AMP format that isn't tied to Google or the AMP specific publishing platform. And so we can go into detail into more of this during the talk, but the idea is if we can create a mechanism to allow ISPs to cluster together, to allow them to share their server resources, share their storage resources, and then to securely decide on who gets to host which content when. The big problem for some of this is that ISPs, in order to make this work at scale, have to share data on what their network looks like, what people are consuming. You obviously don't want to share that data with another ISP because they'll use that to target your business, your customers. And so with cryptography, with what are called multi-party computations, we can create mechanisms that allow multiple different parties to share data and to receive a result without leaking any of their private data. And so we can take together this new packaging format that allows anyone really to distribute content in a secure manner, and it's also available offline. This tool that allows us to allow multiple different parties to compute some result. In this case, we use this to decide where the servers, where the content sits, and then where to direct the user to get that content. And then the fancy flashy buzzword of network function virtualization, which just means we can now use software and virtualize our networks. We don't need to invest in the hard infrastructure. We can buy one server and use it for a variety of different functions and means. And so we think the combination of these three tools presents important technical tools to design a new type of mechanism, which is this kind of cooperative owned CDN. Next slide. And some feathers will obviously be ruffled. Probably some of you here know a lot about content, know a lot of IP. And so we're asking questions of, okay, well, do we want this web packaging format? Is this a good idea? And there was recently, maybe 2 years ago, a meeting that was had to discuss what this new format means for the web. Because a lot of folks realize that this is actually a really big change from how the internet was originally designed. Internet was designed in such a way where if I host content, if I have content, I choose who delegates my content. But then this way allows me to really not be involved in it and know that there's security in that process. And so they were talking about what it does. And so Mozilla said, at its core, origin substitution enables a fundamental change in the way the web works. Content is no longer constrained to follow connections to origins where that content is produced and where it is obtained and can be completely decoupled. Some people don't like this. But in the cases of community networks are a huge tool for access and connectivity, getting content to the last mile in a secure manner, secure content in the last mile. This is huge enabling technology for some of that. Next slide. So what are some other reasons? Next slide. So putting my kind of CS technical hat on, one of the things that there's a difference between quality of service and quality of experience. And this is really important when you're designing a network. Quality of service is something about design of your physical network, your transport infrastructure, your transport layer that affects service delivery or to guarantee certain levels of service delivery. You buy a package, it's 10 megs, 20 megs, 100 megs, whatever it is that you're buying. Quality of service or tool is to ensure that you get that 10 meg that you're paying for. Quality of experience is more about the application layer. If I'm watching a video on Netflix, how can I watch it in such a way where it's not buffering 50% of the time? And so Brian said, we're moving towards the edge, and companies and individuals and organizations are realizing that to really get to quality of experience, you need to engineer better infrastructure, better networks at the edge. A CDN can only do so much. CDN has no idea what's happening in the actual network, only the ISP does. And so the argument here is there's a difference between quality of service and quality of experience, and moving towards an operator-owned CDN, where the operators have visibility into their networks and can use that to customize better content delivery routes, is actually the better way of getting to quality of experience and quality of service. Next slide. There's this thing called buffer bloat. And it's a technical term that essentially just means if I'm trying to watch, if we're all in this area right now and we're all trying to stream Netflix, at some point, our network's going to go out because there's just too many people stuffing packets into the network. And the network is going to try to recover, and it's just going to collapse into the cycle where we're all just going to keep buffering and buffering and buffering. And this is actually a huge problem in the internet. So ever since the internet has been designed, there have been people trying to fix this. And more recently, we've realized that in wireless networks, this is much worse. Because when you have a fixed wired network, there are what we call congestion failures. And so most of the failures that happen there are due to people it's not enough capacity, essentially. But when you have wireless networks, there's things like signal attenuation. Maybe the wind is blowing really hard and your antenna shifts, and then all of a sudden everything drops and you can't really get anything through your network. And so in wireless networks, buffer bloat is a huge issue. And so again, we have to go towards the edge to fix those problems. We can't fix that in a centralized CDN manner. And the other two are sign exchanges open up secure content distribution. Again, this is an important point for community networks and rural wireless networks. And the fourth, what we call oblivious data processing, de-risks private data sharing. And we can get ISPs to use a mechanism that allows them to compute a better way of distributing content amongst their own networks, and we can do it in a way that's secure and private, and we can ensure that we can create a mechanism where data processing is not an issue when it comes to ISPs collaborating. Next slide. So in summary, time we have left, the big idea is if content is the next milestone, we have to focus, particularly in African networks, on that last hop, on what it's like on the edge, and ensuring that content can be delivered with high quality of experience and high quality of service at the edge. This means we need to rethink essentially how we architect things like content delivery networks. Sometimes it's better to just start from scratch. We don't want to be like Anansi trying to pick into different people's pots. Maybe we should design, based given the characteristics of our networks and the problems we face, what a CDN that works for our local niche content looks like. New standards are being discussed as we speak. The slide I had put up before about web packaging is being discussed in the IETF actively. And there are people who have made proposals about why web packaging is actually a really good thing for African content delivery or content delivery in developing countries. And a lot of folks in those panels have been like, no, we don't like this. Let's move on. And so where are we in those discussions, and how are we involved in those discussions around the evolution of the web, the evolution of our browsers and what our browsers can do in order to help us get better quality of experience, and better content. And so this proposal kind of sits at the intersection of the technical, the economic, and some of the other social aspects of building mechanisms like this. And so I'll end this one, put this slide up here, which are just some questions, food for thought, that will feed into our panel discussion. Read through it, percolate, and then I guess we will start our panel discussion, if you can invite the panelists to come up. But yeah, thank you everyone for listening to us rant for a little bit.
A very heated conversation, and I think it touches on the exact problems that we're trying to actually address within the African continent. When you talk about the issues of the content distribution, and obviously also how does Africa advocate for its own consumption of the content that we're creating within the content in a much more affordable and easier way to do that, and cheaper, of course. But to unpack that, I have a panel in front of me, or in front with me, and I will give Brian introduce himself and Innocent, but I will allow Dr. Josiah to introduce yourself, and then pass the mic to the lady to also do the introduction, please.
Right. Thank you, Brian and Bram, and thank you for attending. My name is Josiah Chavula. I'm an academic. I'm a lecturer at the University of Cape Town. My field of study is computer science. I do a lot of research on internet performance. I focus a lot on African internet infrastructure. What are the challenges in terms of the performance, the quality of experience that users experience across the continent. So I'm here to give a little bit of my perspective in terms of how that infrastructure challenge and how the networks are designed in Africa in a way also affects how content is distributed and consumed by Africans. So thank you.
Thank you. Nomshandro, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming. It's nice to see a full room that is very much so interested in what we're discussing. My name is Nomshato Luisinkosunkulu, and I'm from South Africa. I'm actually head of communications at Media Monitoring Africa, but I'm also part of the South African Internet Governance Forum as a committee member there as well. Our work in terms of Media Monitoring Africa, we look at obviously monitoring media in terms of accountability, transparency, looking at media policy, also looking at the work around digital offenses that we've seen obviously come arise ever since the use of internet, which is obviously looking at mis and disinformation, hate speech, incitement to violence, etc. So we do quite a lot of work in terms of the online and offline space. Yeah.
Thank you. So just to start with the conversation itself, well, you can still hold the mic. I'll start with you. I really want to understand before we go into the actual, the deep end, but who are the key stakeholders when we're talking about these Africa content issue? Who are these key stakeholders, you think?
So, I mean, when Brian was discussing this, and I think for me in this panel, most would realize I'm not coming necessarily from a technical point of view. I'm more coming from a content point of view. And what's interesting to see in this presentation as well is that historically, Africa was seen as a content hub. When we're now looking at West and obviously and coming from an African continent as well. And what we've seen is African people have now become content producers. But how do we locate ourselves in such a global space and ensuring that our content is our content, and at the same time we are owning that content? And how has this, obviously in terms of digital media, affected our traditional media landscape? We've seen a lot of media houses having to move away from their traditional ways of doing things to coming now into a digital way of doing things. So since you've gotten new business models which have been news media building a lot of subscriptions, for example, around content. And then the big question is, why should I pay for content? Right. And that also you've seen with OTT platforms, which example, Netflix, why people pay for Netflix, obviously is to watch the different series. But now if you're talking news media, you need to really be convincing in your argument to say, why should you pay to actually, see news, which in most instances, obviously as a national broadcaster should be free. But also, what it means for, content owners as well, in the sense that it's very easy now to distribute content, and it's very easy now to lose the rights to your content. And, as a little owner of a small magazine in a township, and if somebody had to steal, your magazine idea, it's very difficult for them to be able to hold whoever it is accountable, because they don't have the technological know-how. They don't understand how, digital rights work. So it has really been interesting to see that, really diverse change in what content is, how it's consumed, and how it's owned as well.
Innocent, in your own understanding, I mean, would you define these stakeholders differently?
I mean, slightly more specifically, I would, and given that I just made a technical presentation, I would use a kind of a technical response to that being like origin servers are key stakeholders, the content creators, the hosting servers, the people that choose to host content, and the business model and incentives that they have to host African content or to host locally, CDNs themselves, whether they're large generic CDNs, an Akamai or an OTT provider, and Netflix, and et cetera. Even Google runs their own specific CDN for Google and YouTube content, or their own caches. And then the ISP, the actual network that the content at some point is going to travel through. And then the client or the consumer, the end user, the person actually using the internet to consume content and resources. And that bit becomes more interesting when you see the difference between connectivity infrastructure in urban dense populations versus rural areas. And so what are the, what role do rural consumers play? Very, very different from urban consumers in terms of economics and some of the things that play out, or even their rights and digital rights and security. So that's how I would respond to that.
I would want Josiah, I think, respond to that, but I'll have to go off the script a bit, Brian, just to look at the policy aspect. But maybe Josiah, you can respond to the, I mean, from the research that you've done, share with us who are the key stakeholders. I'm asking this because there's a follow-up question to that in terms of how, when we get to the policy aspect, do we have to bring these stakeholders together, or do we just leave it to the the regulators in the room and government? But who are the key stakeholders in your own research that you came across?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think Nomshato and Innocent have tried to list all the important stakeholders, but probably I would stress one. So much as we're talking about content and the technology that might be used to bundle content and stuff, from what I've seen, the big fundamental problem we have in Africa, at least, is that our ISP interconnection is so bad. Okay, maybe just a little bit of a background there. Of course, Innocent and Brian talked a little bit about this. Most of the internet infrastructure is in North America, in Europe, and in Asia, the developed world. So that's where you find the big global ISPs. The interconnection points are in London, in Frankfurt, in those places. That's where the big interconnection happens. Now, our ISPs here are using those big ISPs to transit, to move their content, to move their traffic. And now within Africa, our ISPs are not so densely interconnected. In other words, if Brian's ISP is getting connection through a big ISP A, and Bram's ISP is getting connection from another big ISP, if these two are not somehow directly interconnected, what's happening is that the traffic from a user of Brian to Bram is going to go through these big ISPs, through London, through Cape Town, or some other place. And that is a big problem, because what's happening now is that even though we have some of the CDNs present in Africa, there are not too many, as you saw from the map. We actually have only 6 cities where we've got proper CDNs: Cape Town, Joburg, Lagos, Mombasa, Nairobi, and Cairo. That's all, okay? That's all where the CDNs are. But even in that case, it doesn't benefit so much for the countries that are close to these CDNs, because the interconnections are not there. So even the countries that are close to Nigeria, they're not benefiting much from the Lagos CDN. They're getting content from London and other places. Mozambique and Zambia and Swaziland, sometimes they don't get content from Joburg because of how the interconnection works. So for me, that's a big problem. I could go into a bit of detail why that is happening, but the biggest challenge that our ISPs, and coming back to your question, who are the stakeholders, the ISPs, the local ISPs, the regional ISPs, and of course the regulators in the countries are super important to make sure that the local and regional interconnections are solid. So that when we have a CDN in Joburg, in Cape Town, in the long way, if it happens to come, then it will actually benefit the ISPs that are around, because the interconnection is there. Without the interconnection, it doesn't benefit much, because from what I've done in the research, I've seen that lots of our users in Africa are still being sent to the CDN nodes in Europe and in America to get the content, even though there are some neighboring CDNs here, because the interconnection is so bad, those CDNs in network terms appear to be far away from the users than the interconnection that goes directly to London. So for me, let's get our ISPs together, the local ISPs, the regional ISPs, interconnect. Even before we can get the technology that you're suggesting to work, we will need these ISPs to actually interconnect properly, at least at the national level, and then cross-border interconnection should work, and then the CDNs will actually make sense. Actually, we may not need too many of them. The ones that we have could actually work if we had proper interconnection, so that users in Malawi can easily get content from Cape Town, from Joburg. As of now, that is not the case. So I'll stop here for now. And
So Brian, what I want you to address is, do you think it's a policy issue? So I'm asking this because if you look at Malawi, for example, we have the internet exchange point, but it's voluntary. You know, if I'm an ISP, I can decide, you know what, I'll route through London and come back. That's my cost. I'll bear my own cost. That's fine. I'm able to bear the cost. Do you think we need some regulatory policy intervention to enforce and steer the conversation around, if you are an ISP, for example, one of the requirements is that you have to peer all the traffic, local traffic, let it peer through the local internet exchange point, number one. Number two, that if you're getting international capacity, then the provider that is actually terminating your or carrying your traffic has to make sure that they have some POP within Africa for you to be able to exchange this traffic within the region itself. Is it a policy issue?
Great questions. Very, I think, somewhat controversial, really, to be completely honest, because I've been one of the evangelists going around the continent preaching the gospel of internet exchange points, right from the first internet exchange point in Kenya, which I was involved in building in 2000, which was promptly shut down by the regulator. For those of you who might not know, it ran for 2 weeks and the regulatory authority shut it down. And it took us 1 year of lobbying to get it opened up again. A lot of it had to do with misinformation. We now have a word that describes fake news, misinformation that was being pushed by the telco the incumbent telco, saying internet exchange points are a threat to national security. That was the story that was put out, and our exchange point was shut down. But as I have been around the continent trying to talk to and work with and encourage and motivate internet exchange points in different countries, the biggest challenge is that internet exchange points, as you say, are voluntary, but more importantly, are collaborative and cooperative. So it means that competitors have to sit around a table and agree that they will exchange traffic with each other. Normally, the most compelling incentive that we found that can drive that discussion is the profit motive. Your networks run better if you're connected to an internet exchange point. So maybe the question would be, how can we strengthen the presence, the infrastructure, and the capabilities of our internet exchange points so that ISPs who are not connected cannot compete on the same level as ISPs who are connected? Yeah, that would then automatically become an incentive that drives them to those exchange points. However, I still want to talk about my point that I had regarding stakeholders, and what the point was regulatory authorities, governments. Let me start with government, okay, before I get to regulators. Over the probably 27, 26 years that I've been building and running internet services around the continent, it may not appear as evident, but it is a fact. Government are the largest producer of content across the board. I'm not talking about digital content. Don't get me wrong. But if you talk about just content for the sake of content, government are the largest producers of content in any country. Government are also the largest consumers of content in any country. How many forms do you think governments in Africa receive on their desks every day? If you think of immigration forms, license applications, whether it's examination, you know, the national examinations, and they have to grade all of those examinations. How many forms do you think a government in a year receives? Millions, maybe billions. One government, right? So they are the largest producers. They are the largest consumers. So I would say that the biggest stakeholder when it comes to any kind of content discussion is government. And this means government in all forms and shapes and sizes, whether we are talking about the small clinic in the village or the regulatory authority for the country or the university, the state university. Government comes in many different shapes and forms, but at the end of the day, it's, yes, to me, the most significant stakeholder. And finally, I was just going to touch on the regulatory authorities as being a major stakeholder. And here, not only referring to the communications regulatory authorities, obviously those would look like the most obvious because they're the ones who govern broadcasting, they're the ones who govern internet service provision, they're the ones who govern physical network communications infrastructure. But you also have the financial regulatory regulators. You also have the insurance industry and its regulatory environments and frameworks, because there are a lot of liability issues when you start talking about content. So I'll just leave it there and pass it back to you.
Thank you. I'll come back to Nomshando. So in some discussions, you know, one could actually argue, especially when you're talking to the big CDNs or even the cloud providers. We spoke here that, you know, most of the content that Africa is consuming is either your Netflix, Facebook, TikTok, you know, WhatsApp, and these are, you know, services that are hosted outside of Africa. You know, it does not make sense for these big ISPs to invest in Africa when Africa itself is actually consuming most of the traffic outside of Africa. And so I mean, apart from the music and the, few movies that Brian mentioned, do you think we really have content in Africa that can actually summon these big ISPs to make investments in Africa to exchange traffic locally?
We have a lot of content, large content, worthy content, looking at what each country contributes and putting that all together. And just to give it a bit of a news example, I'm sitting in South Africa. I don't have a full picture of what's happening in Malawi because I can't access their channels or their news channels. I'm sitting in Nigeria. I can't access what's happening on the DRC, except if some sort of unrest comes about, some outbreak comes about. Those are the major agenda news that have been set because Western media has said that, because they are the ones that are reporting on it. And we found that there's no content aggregation to put that all together to say that where can I access if I want to know in terms of continental content. And I think Media 24 in South Africa tried to do that by bringing all the different country news in one site. I'm not sure as to where that is now, but I know it was an attempt to get to that point of, if I want to really know, and I'm not talking World War III is coming about, but if I want to know the achievements of Malawi, I want to know what's happening sports-wise, how their teams are progressing. That is content as well. And because we obviously reach international content first, we almost have them setting an agenda of what we should know about our own content. So in terms of content, we have quite a lot.
We have content, but Innocent, this is very technical. There's some question. The reason why I'm asking this is the website that is hosted locally versus the website that is hosted in AWS, for example. The AWS one will load very quick than the one that I'll access, for example, Macra or for any local service provider. And so because of that, it makes more sense, for me to take my content and host it, as I think in your slide, you actually, showcase this. It makes more sense for me to take my service and put it in Azure, Google, or AWS, because customer experience, which is at the network, at the application layer, is much more better than if I take the same content and host it with Brian ISP. So does it really make a business case that we should actually be talking about the investment of these big ISPs to make sure that content in Africa is exchanged locally when the quality of experience at the application level is compromised?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think I don't know if you're setting a trap for me. So one thing I'll say about, for example, like a website that's hosted locally versus a website that's hosted on AWS, there is a physical limitation to how fast data can move on the network, right? And so if anything transit an international link, there's going to be a minimum amount of time and that's going to affect latency for that consumer. And so go into the future, as we look at how networks in Africa are expanding, a significant number of them are wireless links. And I'll say this over and over and over and over again because it's an issue. The internet TCP, which is the protocol that gets content from you to the next person, is extremely bad in wireless. And then vendor devices make it even worse. And so if we're trying to if we're focusing on the future and future networks and trying to design networks for the future, we can't rely on, AWS does not care about that last mile. They don't care if it's a good antenna up there. They don't care if it's a good router. And that has a huge impact on customer experience at the edge. And so today, looking at it, if I'm choosing between hosting on AWS versus hosting on some local cloud provider, it matters, one, if that local provider is interconnected, if they're at some POP, if they're at an IXP, and that's going to influence whether or not you won't get a case in which my content's hosted on AWS, and let's say the closest AWS server that's close to me is in Joburg or something. That content and the traffic, that speed between that content and content that's hosted maybe a mile away from me, that content that's Malawi from you is going to be faster. If your connection is exiting, if your connection is being terminated at that point, physically, there's no way that that connection will be slow unless your wireless link is pretty slow, but that's going to AWS traffic and the local traffic. So I think the proposal that we're trying to make is to say that African, as they expand into the future, it's not going to be wireless links. And this designing of the future, we have to think towards edge providers and edge networks, and that requires to think of what's the infrastructure that's in place at the edge. So that's, at least that's what I would mean. I'd say there was a huge business case for organizations, not the Nakamai, but a local provider to build that infrastructure for getting content delivered effectively at the edge.
Yes, please.
There's an angle to this particular question that I think we've not covered. AWS, if you look at how many physical servers AWS owns, I don't think you could really say that they own a single one. If you look at where AWS nodes exist, you find that they exist in massive data centers that have already been constructed to be able to carry the services and the content of anybody. So essentially what AWS does is they just go and spin up hard physical machines, and they run in these managed data centers, essentially. And you have a pervasion of these data centers in the developed world, right? You have in the US data centers all over the place, in Asia, in Europe. When you come to Africa and you start looking for data centers, how many are you going to be able to count? I don't think you'll be able to finish your toes and your fingers, really. For the whole continent, 53 countries, you're probably not going to be able to count more than 20 tier 1 data centers in the African continent. And that's a big challenge. Now, who invests in and builds those data centers that AWS operates in? I've built my own data center. It's actually just a few hundred meters away. My small ISP. I am the proud owner of a data center. I call it a data center, but it's really just a single rack of servers. And I host a few customers on it. But your example was excellent because I have my small 100 Mbps connection to the internet. And I'm serving my customers that I'm hosting with that. And they're happy because their audience is right here. They're only interested in them themselves accessing that content, and they're on my network. So it's one hop away. And their audience may be a branch office that is able to access that content on my network, and it's working for them. But the moment that Nomshado tries to access that content from South Africa, it's going to be extremely painfully slow as compared to if that particular content was sitting on an AWS infrastructure on a massive data center that has terabit or petabyte, whatever, connectivity or bandwidth available, which is the level at which these data centers are operating at the moment. If you look at the amounts of bandwidth coming into these places, it's unbelievable, right? I remember a conversation we had some time back in the US. Most of these data centers actually manufacture bandwidth. If you ask yourself the question, where does bandwidth come from? Yeah, it's actually created by most of these data centers in terms of their interconnectivity to each other. And I'm sure that if we allowed Josiah to be unleashed, he can probably give us a lecture of about 3 hours on that topic alone, right? But yeah, I see that we're kind of running towards the end of our time. And so I'll just throw it back to you. I don't know if there are a couple more questions.
I wanted to specifically just get, if we have, we can get 2 from the room, and then from our online moderators, also, if you can just pick 2 from the, wow. Okay, so I'll take Dr. Paulos, I'll take Daud, and then I'll take this before we go into the Zoom room to get 2 from there as well.
I think the order had Dr. Paulos first, right?
before I burn my fingers here.
No, I will be the one burning my fingers. So I'm Paulo Nyirenda. I work for SDNP and also for MISPA, Malawi ISP Association. And I think a lot of issues have come up with respect to ISPs, interconnectivity, exchange points, and so forth. But since this is a CDN session, I wanted to bring in the issue of cost, which I think has not been mentioned by the panelists. At the exchange point in Malawi, the mix, by the way, it's in Blantyre, it's not in Lilongwe. We have some CDNs, Google, Facebook, the usual. And I think that the biggest issue for such a local community exchange point is cost of actually running those CDNs. So if we are planning a regional CDNs for Africa, we need to think about issue of cost. And the biggest cost at an exchange point is cash fill. How do you get the content to the exchange point? In Malawi, this is a major struggle. And I think that if we have a local or regional CDN, SADC, or Africa, we need to find a way of fitting that cash at a reasonable cost. Talking about regional interconnectivity for exchange points, probably it's a non-starter because it kills a number of private sector initiatives on its own. So it's a difficult problem that needs maybe the panelists to look at. I won't comment on the MACRA website. I think the authority is there. Thank you very much.
I see Doc is getting my fingers bent. DG, you're next, and then we'll go to the gentleman here.
Okay, no, thank you. First of all, okay, my name is Daud Suleiman. I'm the Director General for Malawi Communications Regulatory Authority, MACRA. I work closely with Doc and Brian and Bram. Our website is hosted in Malawi, by the way. So we would like to see local content remain local. But then at a personal level, I think, well, speaking on behalf of being a Malawian and my experiences of being in Malawi, is that I think there is a lot of peer pressure on the internet and the issues of content. You see that the conversations that we're having here about Microsoft, Netflix, about going out of Africa, you know, and the more we pay attention to that, is that the divide between the rural and connected and the urban connected, who are the prime customers for Netflix and Microsoft content and what have you, will keep widening. Why is that so? Because first of all, there's a payment issue. Netflix will only accept a MasterCard or a Visa card. And in a country like Malawi, 15% are banked. Out of those 15%, maybe 40% have a bank balance that would allow them to pay for Netflix. Therefore, maybe Netflix have some internal arrangements with Visa and what have you, not to open up the African market, because it doesn't make sense in a sub-Saharan Africa where 480 million mobile wallets are existing. That's sub-Saharan, and that excludes South Africa. So you see that as a very big market. But why is it that these content people that we're busy talking about here are not coming and pushing content inwards into Africa, but they're living in the cities? So this is why all the examples you're giving is Nairobi, Cape Town, Durban, but there is KwaMashu, there is somewhere deep inside KwaJoji, there's Nchisi, there's Karonga, where they're human beings. And over the past 5 years, we've talked about universal access. It's been universal access to what? There's at least one technology that I feel we've done very well at, and that is SMS. And we haven't exploited 20% or even 10% of what SMS as a technology can do to government. Brian, you're talking about government having the biggest of traffic. It's very true. If we take out the rest of the issues that are around government data and operations, but if we were to consolidate and have the national ID work perfectly, it'd be 16 of the fields that I had to fill at immigration are now off, because these things would talk to one another. Therefore, SMS as an opportunity for us to generate local content and utilize local content is being overlooked. And now we're getting attracted to 5G. Almost every week as a regulator, I get someone asking me, when is Malawi rolling out 5G? I'm like, what is 5G? Because in my vocabulary and in the vocabulary of Malawi, the conversations about 5G should not come anywhere near the table, because we have issues with 2G. We have issues with 3G. We have serious issues with 4G. So 4G, if we were to be strict on 4G, we may as well, take out a lot of MNOs, because now the divide is so huge, even within an urban area. 4G service provision is very bad. So as we look at content delivery networks, can we begin to look inward? Can we forget about the big backbones? Can we forget about the big international traffic links and taking content out of Africa to Asia? Can we take content from Lilongwe and take it to Salima? Can we take content from Salima, which is a district in Malawi, and take it to Kombedza, which is a trading center within Salima? Can we take content from Kombedza and take it to the lakeshore facility, which is Sunbed? Can people within Kombedza area create content and move content around? Because eventually we're talking about a digital economy. So how are we going to get to a digital economy if all we're looking at is Azure, Netflix, MasterCard, payments, and we haven't utilized and we haven't gone down to where our people is? So Malawi, we're an interesting setup, 20% urban, 80% rural. So the 80% of 20 million are barely connected to 3G, but they are super connected to 2G. And we want to talk about Netflix. We want to talk about the bigger traffic. It makes sense to someone outside, but it doesn't make sense to the local economy, and it doesn't make sense to our growth as a Malawi identity. I feel sorry that any other corner I go to, it's Mankadzi playing. But we have our own Malawian artists and our own Malawian talent. There's nothing wrong with being pro-Malawian, being pro-Serbian, or being pro-South Africa. But what has South Africa done? They have a platform called DSTV and GoTV, which pushes the agenda and pushes the narrative of South Africa to our houses. 5, 10 years down the line, the legacy and the stories of Malawi, the folklore and the music of Malawi will be diluted. All our musicians will sound like P Square. All our musicians will sound like Burna Boy. All our musicians in Chichewa, they'll sound like Mankadzi. And now there is a Malawian in me that say, no, wait a minute. So this content issue, I think it's time we begin to look at it from a country perspective and say, okay, when we say content, let us remain within country, let us not cross borders and see what we can do. So there's a whole lot that we can do. 20 million people is not a small market. If someone can ignore 20 million people, then I don't know what sort of business you're looking at. Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Toba Bani. I'm from Nigeria. I'm the Vice President of Nigeria Internet Registration Association that's responsible for the .ngccTLD. I'm also the CEO of a company called Google Host. We're a local cloud provider in Nigeria. And the conversation so far have been quite interesting, and I love the contribution from the guys. It's just quite interesting. That's right beside me. So I'll tell the Nigerian story. Content, and I'm sure, I mean, that was even raised in the during presentation. There's quite a lot of content, especially from Nigeria. I remember about 20 years ago, we listened to, Usher, we listened to Backstreet Boys and the likes. Now today, we're talking about Burna Boy, Wizkid, Davido, a lot of Nigerian artists that become global. And that clearly shows that Africa has content. The problem, unfortunately, is that our content is not carried within Africa. Instead, it is shared with international providers, and then they bring it back to us. But then I sometimes wonder why, but it's because we probably lack the infrastructure, the distribution networks. I'll give an example. DSTV was launched Africa Magic. And because of African Magic, they were able to invest heavily in African content. Now, Netflix has started the same thing. And Netflix has a bigger budget, bigger pockets. And now we're seeing some really, really good African movies hosted on Netflix. I mean, really, really good. It's good for Africa, but we also may be losing a lot. So the question is, can we stop this? I don't think so. Innovation is such that no one can control it. Where innovation goes, the people go. And because we're in a global economy, there's a large chance that the global leaders will lead the innovation. We can try to manage it, but I have seen that except we get as serious as China, where you control everything, there's nothing you can do. There was a discussion about how to get ISPs to cooperate together. Compelling them from a regulatory point of view, at least in Nigeria's case, won't work. It has to be a business case. There has to be a benefit for all. Why would an exchange point exist? For example, we have internet exchange point in Nigeria, and it's a non-governmental initiative that was encouraged by government. So government started the process, but allowed, it to be private. And then the internet exchange point had to create incentives for interconnectivity amongst the different ISPs in Nigeria. And then had to also start encouraging these international providers to come in, because the idea is internet exchange point really makes sense when there's a reason to interconnect. If most of the content being consumed is outside the country, then there's no point. So the content has to be hosted locally. So that means it's like a chicken and egg scenario. Should we interconnect before the content comes in, or should the content come in before interconnecting? And why would the content come in when there's no interconnection? So it's a very difficult battle and difficult discussion. But I can imagine from a technical point of view, internet exchange points in various countries across Africa, then interconnected. What that means is that even if we don't own the content in our own settings, if it's Netflix, YouTube, I mean, we can't stop that. They're already global, everybody's consuming them. But if they now see that Africa has an infrastructure where consumption is connected, then they would have no choice but to come in. Now, what does that mean? Facebook, for example, at one time in Nigeria was giving access to Facebook for free on some ISPs. And the reason they could do that was because they were in country and they had partnerships with ISPs, because it benefited them for people to consume. Early 2000s, Google in Nigeria did something called Get Nigerian Businesses Online, GNBO. Because at that time, they realized that there wasn't a lot of local content. And so they wanted to encourage local content. So what did they do? They gave free site builders. They worked with banks. They worked with ISPs and several local providers to push people to create content locally. Because for them, if people are searching locally, then they'll make money from ads. It's a business deal for them. But it is possible that we can all benefit. It makes sense to business people, makes sense to government, makes sense to consumers. But talking about rural Africa is very difficult. because who is going to pay the bills? Even local ISPs invest more in the urban regions because you can afford data. You can afford to, get on these platforms. But if I put 4G in a local, in a very rural area, I mean, what are they going to do with it? At least that's the thinking of the ISPs. Who is going to pay for the infrastructure? In some cases, who is going to protect the infrastructure? Because, I mean, probably the batteries that are powering the mast is worth more than the connection. And that's what happening in some parts of Nigeria where there's actually a blackout because they are damaging the infrastructure. And so the benefits, it's very difficult. But I do believe that it doesn't always have to be one way. I think we can have it all. For example, what stops us from having local content hosted locally by universities such that students can actually access learning materials for free? And we can even do it across Africa. I do imagine an Africa that's interconnected to the point where many of these things are available for free. I had a discussion about, video content, talking about an African story. Now imagine if that was available for free. Imagine a partnership with Google where we could actually have access to some of this content for free. I think that Africa is the future. I think these guys know it. I think we need to play our part as well. I think that if we are able to, governments, private institutions, and everybody come together to understand the value that we have to give, because I don't think it's in our interests that we always have to go so far to access our own content or to access content across the globe, especially in today's world where we can see that disruptions are happening everywhere and you don't know what the world tomorrow is going to look like. I think it's in our interest that most of our content are in country, or at least for now, we can access them through some kind of exchange point connectivity across Africa. I do believe that Africa is the future. I know that there's been a lot of disbelief in the value that we have to give, but I do think that a lot is coming out from Africa. We are beginning to see that we have content to give. Our content may not be as refined as the Western world, but it's our content, and our content is beautiful. And I think that as long as we continue to understand that we have content and we start working together to encourage these guys, they know, what's interesting is that they know it's until when it makes a business sense for them before they come in. AWS is coming in. AWS has been in South Africa for a while. They're looking at West Africa, Nigeria specifically. Google has been here for a while. Facebook, Netflix is thinking about it. So my conclusion is this. I think that government has to make an incentive for all this content provider globally, content producers locally, ISPs, everyone coming together, making the costs reduced and seeing how we can make it work together. And I think at the end of the day, it will work for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we'll take 2 from online, and then I think most of the interventions were just comments. Yeah, 2 from online moderators. We don't have anything? Okay, so maybe we can take, so I can take one at the back. You wanted to, it's good. So I can take those last 2 and then we can wrap up the session. Did we have anyone attend online? Guys? How many? Okay.
Great, thank you so much. My name is Oni Kamakwakwa. I am with the Alliance for Affordable Internet. I think I'm really encouraged a lot by the conversations here today. Recognizing, however, that content exists within an ecosystem where for most of us, half of the people in our countries are still not able to connect online because of affordability and other issues that contribute towards digital divide. But the lack of relevant content is also another one that we have not really honed in so much on. I often say that we want people to go online to do what? To read English, to play Facebook, but there's a real need for developing our online content, but also recognizing it. I think for me, what troubles me is that our innovation has very much looked outwards as opposed to inwards. We want to be the next Uber of Africa. We want to be the next Amazon of Africa. We are going to be the next Silicon Valley of Africa. And I think that this conversation, if anything comes out of it, is the need to recognize that we need to innovate for our own needs and our own benefits within the continent. That, the Ubers will be there, the Amazons will be there, but what is it that addresses Africa's realities that we need to begin to focus and reshape our innovation around, as opposed to continuously copying and centering the West and then being critical of the West being centered. So it also just really truly begins with us recognizing that our innovation has very much been outward looking to redo what we've seen in the West. But there's a lot of needs in our own region, and how do we begin to innovate for our own needs? Rural communities continue to be left behind. In fact, post-COVID, the rural-urban divide is even greater. And we need to get to the point where we understand that when a village doesn't have water, they have the know-how of how to bring water to the village, how to dig wells. What is that solution on the connectivity side? We've got conversations around community networks, and we know that where there are community networks, there's greater meaningful connectivity and there's opportunities for content as well. And how do we begin to bring those conversations together? And what I'm looking forward to in this session is, what are the next steps we can take? I think we all know the good ideas, the rhetoric, the slogans, and all of that. But what is it that comes out of this conversation that we can begin to implement even at a small scale? I had a really great idea about universities hosting the content. Who is already doing that and who's willing to give it a shot to begin to move these conversations forward so that we can now be accountable and have some consequence management for failing to actually implement our own ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Onika. One last one, and then we leave the room to the next session coming in.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Ibrahim, a fellow from Article 19, and I'm really happy to listen to all what have been said so far. So I just want to some questions out there about content and the internet. Now, I'm not so sure about this, but I will just say it anyway. I think the internet is more Western than Africa. Yes, most of the content is in English, and still some local communities where I come from still don't know how to read English, and then the internet is not so relevant to them. So now I'm thinking, now what if we can have, is there a possibility, or would it make sense? How can we go about it, making messaging applications that work for communities, that is built by communities and works for communities? Now, an example is I don't have to, why can't I have something like WhatsApp, maybe even better, that works for my community, for example, where I can talk to, where people in my community can use these applications to communicate offline, and then first, and then I know that, okay, if I want to talk to people that are far away from me, then I can switch to WhatsApp. Now, also talking about community networks and the content hosted on those networks. Now, the content hosted on those networks, I know some are not, I'll give example. Some materials and educational resources hosted on some community networks that I know are in English, even when the majority of the people or the marginalized people in the community don't really understand English. Now, I don't know if there are any solutions out there that allows community themselves to create content and then host it on a particular network one time, easily and easily, where anybody can just create content and then send it to the network, and every other person in that community can access the content without having access to internet, something that works offline for a community. I'm looking at that possibility, and I hope I will have some people around here to maybe talk about it too.
There's a session at 3, James is 3, addressing exactly the same issue. Be sure to attend to that question.
All right, thanks. Thank you.
I'm being sensed that time is completely out. Like 1 minute each one of you. Just let. Just 1 minute, Brian, and then Josiah, Innocent, and then we.
Yeah, I like what Toba said. The future is Africa, or Africa is the future, right? I was just saying to myself in the back of my mind, everybody else knows it except the Africans. But yeah, I think this is definitely a conversation starter. So I think we should try to see how we can continue this conversation in different forums with the different perspectives that we bring to the table. I was just thinking about, okay, community networks has emerged in the last couple of comments, which is critical and it's very important. Think about disk storage, okay? Content has to be stored on something. And that in today's world is a disk, okay. In 1990, 1 gigabit of storage cost $500,000. A 1 gigabit hard disk or disk cost $500,000. Today, 1 gigabit costs less than 4 US cents. So my closing remark is, how about pushing our content onto those community networks right in those communities, in the languages of the communities?
Thank you. So maybe just because of time, maybe one quick comment. I think the Director General of MACRA made a really good comment about maybe we focus too much about content that's outside than what's here. But maybe one of the key questions that we need to ask is, what content are the people in rural places that we are talking about? What content are they actually consuming? Many of us studies show that they are actually accessing the same content that people in the city are trying to access. The same YouTube videos that you watch, they want to watch it and stuff like that. Except where we have community networks, we've seen people in those local communities create their own content, consume it, but also they want to push that content outside. So I think we need to have a conversation on how local national networks are going to be built so that the rural places are also able to access that content, which is in the urban settings. And I think that's where MACRA and the ISPs can really work together to enable those people to access that content. Thank you so much.
Guys, if you can allow me to curtail the conversation, really out of time. I see the guys are actually standing in front of us. A round of applause to our panelists. Good presentation. Let's get the conversation going. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you. Thank you.